introduction, and welcome to everybody. I'm guessing I'm talking to a lot of colleagues here. It's been a long term and I think we're all very tired. So what I've done is I've outlined the experience of meditations, which was my last major exhibition in 2018. And part of that involved a trip to Japan, and I've included a few slides which are really just postcards kind of thing, postcards from Japan, just to kind of keep things relaxed and informal, and hopefully you know, let things run along a little bit more in a more entertaining fashion for what's been a long and busy term. So meditations, as I said, it was my last major exhibition, and it was held in Guilford Cathedral in the spring of 2018. And it was quite an experience. I began work on it in 2014, and the idea was to exhibit in Guilford Cathedral the following year. But fate intervened when building work on the cathedral roof took far longer than anticipated, a lot longer than anticipated. They uncovered all sorts of problems there. So the exhibition was kind of in this floating world for about 3 or 4 years before it was actually shown. But in a funny kind of way, that sort of acceptance of the way things unfold kind of formed part of the ethos behind the project, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. But needless to say, a lot. I've always had an interest in spirituality and spiritual dimensions to my work, and that whole idea of just accepting fate and just accepting the situation as it was kind of formed part of the whole process, really. I mean, you know, I had no control over the cathedral roof, but some exciting things came out of that process. So let's give you a little bit of background. As Abby said, I studied for my well, it was an HND in those days at Rochester. One of the tutors there was Colin Pearson. And Collins probably was the biggest influence on the way I handled clay, the way I treated clay, and the kind of work that I wanted to make. It's very vessel based, but there's a stately, grounded quality about these pieces that also kind of stretch back. They have a kind of timeless suggestion of there's a suggestion of age to the surface. And a suggestion of longevity and that relationship with the past, as well as being in their own way, I think, you know, contemporary pieces of work. And Colin was a big influence on me with regard to these elements of ceramic practice. I use the wheel. I'm a thrower. I love the movement and the flow, and I think you can see that here in Colin's work. So in the early 90s, when I began to forge my career, I was making, shall we say, one of a kind, as Colin called it, or one-off vessels. And these were geared towards galleries, of which there were a lot more around in those days. And so I began to build a name for myself, having developed this very, very vivid turquoise blue, which was inspired by the turquoise colours of medieval Islamic ceramics. And then in the late 90s up to about 2012, I sort of was really, I mean, consistent throughout my career has been this sort of influence of the Far East, and dealing with that influence has been an interesting dialogue. I call it a dialogue. Sometimes it's been very frustrating. Sometimes it's felt like a weight around my neck. Other times it's you know, it's provided me with tremendous sense of freedom. But needless to say, as a ceramicist, Bernard Leach weighs heavy upon my background and of my generation. That really, you know, he really sort of did provide me with that sort of interest in Far Eastern ceramics. And in the last 10, 12 years, I've begun to focus on that influence, and I've begun to I developed this notion of interpreting over replicating, because a lot of my peers and the generation before me were very influenced by Japanese ceramics, which were introduced to the country through Bernard Leach and Shoji Hamada. And to an extent, I mean, it's a difficult one, because I wouldn't say people copied, but let's just say they were very influenced. And while I love Japan, I speak a little bit Japanese, I've been there quite a lot, I just love the culture. I'm not Japanese, you know. I'm from the UK. I'm from Maidstone in Kent. You know, I've got my little estuary accent twang still floating around. You know, that's my manner, that's my patch, that's my culture. You know, and you know, what's the point of copying, you know, another another style, another approach of ceramics? And how we deal with influence has governed me quite heavily in the last 10, 12 years. And there's no right or wrong to it. It's as long as I feel quite satisfied, as long as I've got that dialogue open, you know. And I like discussing that. So this is the kind of work that I made. I think those of you that are familiar with ceramics, there is that Far Eastern look about these pieces. And then in the early 2000s, I went to the Royal College of Art, and it was there that I was introduced to surface in a very, very different way. So if we go back to these, now take a note of the date, late 90s to 2012. This is 2001, 2002 at the RCA, and I was introduced to colour and surface in a way that you don't really see here. Here we're looking at form. You know, yes, the glaze plays a role, but it's very integrated into the form. Here, I've kind of begun to say something very, very clear about the surface. And I'll be honest with you, it was all too much, you know, and I kind of went back to what I kind of knew. But nevertheless, the purpose of that MA was to shape me up and sow some seeds. And it took a while. It took meditations to really bring those seeds, you know, up into sort of, you know, to bloom, if you like. Here you can see a surface. I've always liked function. I've always enjoyed function. I am gradually pulling away from that, although my work is still vessel based. But again, I put this in because it shows the surface, and it also says something about the generation that I'm part of. When we went to college, when I went to Rochester back in the 80s, it was a very, very much very skill-based studio pottery course. I was introduced to printing at the Royal College of Art through Steve Brown, who now runs the ceramics and glass course up there. And I began to focus on this notion of the stately grounded, the sort of ceremonial vessels that you saw in the work of Colin Pearson. You know, I wanted to explore this idea of spirituality, of ceremony, of specialness, if you like, within a vessel. And upon leaving the RCA, I approached Winchester Cathedral. Meditations is my second cathedral exhibition. I approached Winchester for my first one. I just want to jump back. There's a little bit of toing and froing in this presentation. I just want to jump back to what I was saying about me being, you know, a man of Kent. I am a man of Kent, not a Kentish man. I'm a man of Kent, and this whole notion with influence in the East, you know, and you know, I think these two examples, piece of mine on the right there, I've tried to echo some of the traditional kind of crisscross slipware patterns from English ceramics, but using the kind of, there's the kind of spirit of the kind of wabi-sabi Japanese approach to throwing there, but you know, it begins a kind of, you know, tennis match, a dialogue, you know, a back and forth between various influences that belong to me and my cultural background. On the road to the Winchester Cathedral exhibition, I have to say that drawing plays an important role in my work, and it's about to perform a really important role with my latest project, but I'll talk to you about that at the very end. As I say, this was my first exhibition in a cathedral. It was called Ritual and Setting, and the work I made here was quite large. I wanted to challenge people's perceptions about porcelain. I was looking at the surface. I saw this as very much separate to the work that you saw with the heavy white glazes on earlier on. This was like a sort of, for me, it was like a sort of one-off project. I was working on that idea of the surface that was introduced to me at the RCA. I was working on this sense of mass, of weight, of physicality, and I was inspired by stone fonts. And also what those fonts symbolized, you know, the ceremony that they are in place for, to celebrate a new life, but gathered around that font would be parents, grandparents, maybe even great-grandparents. And again, that kind of echoes to my fascination of time and memory. But the work for meditations was much smaller. And we're going to come to that in a minute and the reasons why I did that. But there's some shots of Winchester. That was in 2009. Two different types of clay I used, the dark clay and then the porcelain. But these guys were big. These were big pieces of work, and I fired them in a brickworks kiln. So we get on to meditations. There's Guilford Cathedral. Now, Winchester obviously is a very ancient building, and Guilford is not. That was deliberate. I wanted to come into a kind of more modern arena, more light, more bright, more spacious, and explore that idea of the space around my work. And this is where it kind of really begins. This is where I really went back. I really went back to when I was about 18, I think, and it was in 1981. I was going to pottery classes in Tovel, a suburb of Maidstone, that were given, private ones, by a lady called Jill Brown, and she took a small group of her sort of evening class students up to see an exhibition at Tate Britain. I mean, it was just the Tate then in those days. It was pre-Tate Modern. And we went to see The Essential Cubism, which was a fantastic exhibition. And I remember being absolutely bowled over by that. And towards the end of the day, and I can remember this so clearly, I chanced upon the room that contained Mark Rothko's Seagram murals. And I've written in the catalogue for meditations, as I crossed the threshold into the space, I experienced a power that was both awe-inspiring and peaceful. I witnessed how those who entered the room were immediately hushed and moved slowly and respectfully towards the benches where they sat to contemplate the work. And it was more than the work. It was the work in that space, the power of that work and the power that it had on people as they walked in. And that's the kind of thing that these sacred spaces intrigue me. And again, you know, I've always been drawn to them, whatever the religion or creed that inspires them. An element of this is how such spaces affect people and influence their behaviour within them. And I do not believe that immensity of scale is necessary in order to produce a sense of awe. A small Japanese tea house can provoke the same response as can a vast cathedral, for me. The room that housed the Seagram murals was far smaller than any cathedral, but it seemed to instill a similar reverence in its visitors. Perhaps then the way in which a space is composed is of more importance. You know, I've got a picture here of Winchester, and then a contemporary tea house, and then a more traditional tea house. And there's just something magical about these spaces. That time out, that time to still the mind and to contemplate. So I decided that I was going to go and do a residency at the Shigaraki Ceramic Cultural Park in Shigaraki, Japan, which is about 45 minutes from Kyoto on the bus. And as you can see, it's set in the countryside in rural Japan. Shigaraki is a very small town, but there's this enormous kind of cultural park where There are residency studios and a gallery and a museum of 20th century ceramics on site, and outdoor kilns. The town itself is largely populated by potters who fire wood-fired kilns, and it's a very ancient town. But what I find fascinating about it is that it seems to, while it's it's moved with the times in the sense that there's telephones and motor cars and things like that. It's still quite small. It hasn't sort of really traded on its tradition. It's just there. It's respected, but but on the suburbs is this huge sort of focal point of that flags up that wonderful tradition. There are regions in Japan that produce certain types of pottery that still do produce certain types of pottery, and Shigaraki is one of them. And while I was there, I wanted to try some new ideas with some different clays. I wanted to keep this idea of the vessel. I've always been drawn to the plasticity of clay. I love the sense of movement that and the intimacy that the potter engages with when producing work. And I think it's that kind of deep involvement that has always attracted me. So anyway, ceremonial vessels, it was a kind of loose theme floating around, and the idea of urns. I was coming away from being inspired by fonts, and I began to kind of make these sealed urns, as I called them. Now you can see that they have lids, but the lids don't work. They're notional. The work is about kind of trapping that internal space and keeping whatever is within completely sealed off and treasured. I played about with some techniques where I would stretch the clay and making partly thrown pieces of work and then putting them over these stakes and banging the stakes so the clay stretched to then create jars. Now, while this was going on, I was also working on another project called Shima Karashimi, which is Japanese from island to island. This was going on at the same time. So this was just coming to an end. And this was with a Japanese potter, and I made the work, and my colleague in Japan decorated the work, and this sort of came to a culmination just as I was finishing up in Shigaraki. I was nipping up to Tokyo to kind of finish off work that we'd earmarked for this exhibition, which opened in the autumn of 2014. But the reason I dropped this slide in was to kind of emphasize that, well, actually, I say my love of Japan. Of course, I had a love of Japan, but I was actually very, very lucky because I made this work at Tokyo University for the Arts, which is Japan's premier art college. It's their kind of Royal College of Art, if you like. And I worked with a member of staff who mirrored exactly my position at UCA. I worked then 2 days a week, and she worked 2 days a week at Tokyo. And we met at an international symposium that is held every 2 years, and began to talk about what, surfaces and decoration. And this kind of prodded me to kind of think about that idea of decoration, that idea of applying a surface to a form, which I did as part of Winchester, of course I did. But I began to kind of take this on more subconsciously, really. I wasn't really aware of it at the time. So I made these pieces, and Risa decorated them. Then so I've got some general shots here of the studios at Shigaraki, and some of the other artists that were working there. At any one time, there's usually about 12 of us, and they can be from all over the world. There's always an allowance. There's always an allowance made for Japanese potters and artists who work. There's always about 3 or 4, and then there'll be another 5 or 6 people from anywhere all over the world. These are kind of like the postcard slides. I would cycle to the supermarket, do my shopping. Really was really going native at this point. It was great. I loved it, and my smattering of Japanese was because it's so unusual, for like the men and women that work in supermarkets to hear in their eyes a tourist, having a go at Japanese, and they loved it. They absolutely loved it. But it was wonderful. And the setting of the part, that was kind of like outside my bedroom window with the lovely Japanese maple trees. So as I mentioned, I popped up to Tokyo while I was working on meditations to just finish off the Shima Karashimi exhibition. And so here I am just doing a demonstration over there to the students. There's Maggie from the USA was there, and a Ugandan student whose name escapes me at the moment. He was working there, finishing his PhD. But it was great fun to go up there. The Shigaraki Fire Festival. There was no choice. We all had to take part in this. And I thought it was going to be just standing around a bonfire. I had no idea. It was at the end of July when it gets very, very, very hot. And it seemed the most ridiculous time to have a fire festival, but hey, that's what you do. And then I thought we'd be waving a little torch when they mentioned torches. I had no idea there were going to be these massive bamboo things which were really heavy and very hot. And we all made our way, hundreds of us, made our way out of the village of Shigaraki and walking up into the hills, which were just full of, brush, that was absolutely dry, and there were sparks dropping everywhere. But lots of volunteer villagers turn up with water tanks on their back and like plant sprays. So they're just constantly spraying all the sparks as they fall down, in the middle of the hottest time of the year. But it was great. You can see I probably worked up a bit of a sweat there. And then back into the town where there was we had the Kodo drummers drumming, and it was a big celebration. It was a religious festival, the fire festival. I would go into Kyoto quite a lot, and I took some pictures. I visited Kwai Kanjiro's house. Kwai Kanjiro was a potter, also a commentator, if you like, on the crafts in Japan, a bit like Soetsu Yanagi. And this is his house, which is preserved as a museum. His studio and kiln are out the back, but it's just so beautiful, and this idea of a sense of walking into a house like that. Every object seems to have its place, and every object seems to have this sense of reverence and ceremony about it, where it is and where it's placed and how it's positioned. It's absolutely captivating. And of course, with that, the smells, these are the bits that the photographs can't convey, that old kind of wooden smell, and the tatami mats, unless you've been there, you won't know what I mean. But it's magical. So let's get back to the surface and how I began to develop my work. I was using, I began to look at Japanese coloured ceramics, looking at their enamels. But again, I wanted to, again, not copy, I wanted to replicate, I wanted to interpret over replicate. And, and as I said, that's an ongoing thing. And I was working with these colours that go under the glazes onto the bisqued ceramics, and again experimenting with brush marks, pulling on the sources of inspiration that have always fascinated me, which is about the division of space, looking at where things meet. It could just be something like the junction where my iPhone you know, is sitting against the old wood of a table or something like that. I love junctions and meeting points. And I also talk about music as well. I like music, you know, that sense of notation and trying to convey that in the work. So sources of inspiration that I sort of reintroduced myself to were the abstract expressionists, Robert Motherwell, Cy Twombly, this wonderful kind of freedom, which I still battle with today, trying to get that sense of freedom. And then music I talked about as well. John Cage, who developed his own sense of musical notation, and also did his own paintings and drawings. All this stuff is going into the mix and is informing the sense of placement and the way I go about my work. You know, there's an underlying rhythm to the thrown clay, you know, the marks that the fingers make, you know, and it's almost as though that in itself is a kind of stave, you know, upon which, you know, colours or notes can be placed. And again, that's something I find. I came back to the UK with new work from Japan, and was picked up by the agents James and Jessica Rawlin, who exhibited the work this was in a private residence in Holland Park alongside the paintings of William Scott. They have permission from the Scott estate to deal his work, and so I had this amazing exhibition where for the first time work that was developed from meditations and Japan was shown. So while the cathedral roof was being made, we had this three and a half year gap. So all the work from Japan was in boxes at this time. And I began to take that experience of studying the Japanese processes and techniques of on-glaze colouring and develop it. And this was good because it gave me time to you know, really get to know some of the materials and techniques. And so I began to be much more kind of eclectic about the processes and the materials that I used. I wasn't just using on-glaze enamels, I was using underglaze colours, I was finding transfers, I was using transfers and ready-made transfers, I was making my own as well. And so I really then, by now, I'd completely dropped the earlier work that you saw at the beginning and was just focusing on this. So from an artist who was constantly working with form, I was now really looking at surface and looking at the relationship between the surface and the form. And that gets us to Meditations, the exhibition, which opened in 2018. So it was a mixture of the original pieces made from Japan and then the work that I then developed as a result of going to Japan. And Simon very, very kindly offered to open the exhibition, and he wrote a lovely piece. The full version you can see, you can access on my website. But as ever, typical Simon, knew exactly what to say and how to say it in a way that I could only ever dream of. But as you can see, when you look around that cathedral, you can't see any of the pots. And that's because they were kind of stationed in their own little zones, and this was part of the kind of ethos behind the exhibition. And I remember this is a book that I could never read cover to cover, but I dip in and out of The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard, and he introduces the chapter Intimate Immensity, which in itself I think is a wonderful notion, intimate immensity, and that helped inform the work. With the words of Jules Vallée, who says, "Space has always reduced me to silence." And I think that again pulls in all those threads that I was talking about earlier on about the sacred space, the spiritual experience. You know, it took me back to that day in 1981 when I was 18. You know, to when I crossed the threshold into the room where the Seagram murals were, you know, and that was a spiritual experience. You know, it was wonderful. And so I began to nail down, you know, a philosophy behind meditations, which shifted from the original notion. You know, it was going to be about the sealed urns, and it was going to be about space within a space, and it was, you know, but because I had this gap while we were waiting for the roof to be repaired, I was able to develop the ideas a little bit more, and I began to think about this space within a space, you know, and for me, meditations, it was about exploring spaces within a space, the experience of specific spaces and the resulting spiritual contemplation, something that's both intimate and immense. As a potter, I used the wheel to pull up a skin of clay in order to envelope a space, and the pot needs this internal space to exist, even if, as with some of the pieces in meditations, the space is completely enclosed. I like that idea that the space is still there. And if we move on now, so we can see, so here you can see a group of pots which, when the public were in the cathedral, we just pushed them back into those alcoves a little bit. But again, like I can't speak for all of you practitioners, but certainly for me, you know, I always find it difficult to talk about my own work, and to have the privilege of Adrian Bland write the catalogue for this exhibition was wonderful, because really he just captures everything that I was trying to get across. You know, we had a long chat, and he went away and wrote just something so fantastic. I mean, it's just awesome. I love it, and what a lovely man Adrian is too. And I think here, you know, you can see, you know, parts of our discussion was this idea about time, you know, and about just sitting with time. And I can remember, you know, having thoughts about, you know, why would I want to make a pot look old? You know, what is it about, you know, aging the surface? You can use various techniques to kind of age the surface. You know, is that disingenuous in some way in trying to, you know, and the answer is there isn't probably a right or wrong. It depends what you're trying to do. But you know, my example was you know, I used to try and do this with wives, to try and make them look older than they really were. And it just never sat right with me. And then, of course, the answer was right in front of my face, is that there's nothing I can do. Time will take care of itself. You know, my lifespan is gone in a second compared to, you know, more, you know, cosmology and things like that. It means absolutely nothing, but that time, you know, will do its work if it's allowed to, you know. And Adrian and I spoke a long time about that. And again, you can download his text from my website, so you can read it. But it picks up on some of these ideas that I think in such spaces, and they don't have to be Christian spaces, but in such spaces, we tend to reflect upon. These pots were located in little alcoves and little areas around the cathedral, so that visitors had to kind of stumble upon them, if you like. And there was always plenty of space around them, and they were always located in areas where one could stop, pause, either sit down or just focus on them. And that's what it was about. That was the brave part of the exhibition, because my contemporaries and peers, when they're presented with a cathedral, you tend to go big, but I didn't want to compete with the scale on this occasion. You know, I just wanted to create little like moments, little areas within the cathedral. And as Adrian says here, and I mentioned, you know, about my early reticence to decoration, and holding back from being a potter who paints, because they are out there. There are potters who paint, and I struggle with that idea. That's a personal thing. I'm not making a comment about others. It's just that I tend to be all or nothing. And for me, it's, you know, it's the ceramicness of my work that is crucial. And as Adrian says here, such reticence was perhaps first confronted technically with research into the right materials and processes, the right temperatures to push the marking into the pot so that the surface is not sitting on the form, but rather it becomes integral to it, and that the pot retains a ceramic integrity that somewhat refutes the notion of clay as canvas. And that again, you know, I couldn't write that, but Adrian has just nailed it bang on. You know, when you run your fingers over these, you don't feel any change in texture to where the colours are. You know, I've spent a lot of time developing colours that sit right back in the glaze, so that they could be nothing but ceramic. And it's what I am. You know, I'm not a painter. You know, this is what I do. Thanks, Abby. The Reverend Canon Julie Gittos wrote some wonderful pieces as well for the catalogue, and she was hugely supportive of the exhibition, and hugely apologetic for the time that it took for the roof to get repaired. But of course, you know, like me, she had no power over that. But again, you know, that idea of accepting things as they are, just kind of, it just all sort of came together and just sort of made this thing happen. And here she sort of talks about the space, you know, the wider space, you know, away from my work. Now here's some of those pieces that I showed that were being made in Shigaraki, and here's how they ended up. And again, we tucked them away in little nooks and crannies around the cathedral. And again, we spoke about, you know, security, you know, and about the risks that things could get stolen. And I did insure the work, but I wasn't going to look into fixing it. I was just going to just trust in the better part of human nature, and nothing got nicked, and that was great. I mean, obviously, I think that might have a lot to do with the type of people that are attracted into a cathedral, but they have a lot of visitors, a lot of school kids. Nothing got nicked, nothing got broken, and I was quite happy for that. That was great. But I wanted to see how they sat, you know, in a different environment as opposed to the ancient one. And again here, and these pieces were made, you know, after Japan. So these were more recent pieces at the time of the exhibition. And then we go back to the Japanese ones there. And this is where it took me today. So, you know, if we just sort of jump back to those, you know, I can see how that work has developed, and how it continues to be developed as I increase my understanding and develop my vocabulary. And these are the two most recent pieces that I had out of the kiln last week. You know, they're forever developing, and what I'm interested in is looking at creating a sense of depth with porcelain, which is quite difficult to do, because in some respects, although it's a beautiful looking material, it can be quite harsh, quite cold, even though, you know, I can make it sumptuous and juicy and soft. You know, there is a clinical sort of look about that white porcelain, and creating a sense of depth is beginning to happen now. The kind of depth I was after is beginning to happen, and so in a sense, even though like the pots themselves in Guilford Cathedral were like stations of focus, stations of contemplation, the exhibition itself was just a station in my career, you know, to where it's going. And I mentioned about drawing, and I showed you those drawings at the beginning that I was doing for Winchester Cathedral. And I'm now embarking on a project which involves the making of a film, but it also involves me responding literally, quite as literally as I can, drawing. And I'm working with a Japanese artist who lives in the UK, and she's a calligrapher, and I'm going to explore this idea of taking the surface marks and giving them form. So it really is going to be like a huge step, and I will probably treat it a bit like I treated Winchester. I will treat it as a kind of one-off project that stands alone. I might not, I don't know, because it's so, the outcome is so unknown at this stage. But here, even though I'm integrating the colours and the marks into the clay and into the glaze, for me, the next logical step is to take those marks and to try and add form, so that you can get an even, the closest possible integration. And it should signal a huge change in my work. But I'm working with a filmmaker, Alex J. Wright, who is experienced in working with craftspeople. And we've just completed an Arts Council bid for a research and development phase, with a view to going to Japan for phase 2, and possibly even going to Shigaraki again, but with a completely different mindset and a different kind of mission to look at how drawing and mark making can become, can become form. And that's something that I'm quite looking forward to. But it's one of these things that's just was sparked by this, and all the things that lead up to these pots here. I guess, I mean, they happened on that day in 1981 when I went into the Seagram Room, and it just sort of did something for me that nothing else had ever has done. So that kind of brings me to an end. If you want to treat yourself for Christmas, send me an email. I've just had these mugs. I've worked with a design company. They're industrially made, and they've taken one of the designs from Meditations, and we've produced these mugs. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. And if you've got any questions, we shall answer them.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ashley. I think that's, as you said, exactly what we need, actually, and what has been a very difficult year is some of these stories behind research, and it's certainly given me a lot to think about. But if anyone else would like to ask questions, if you could use the raise hand function.
Oh, we've got Linda. Hello, Linda, and Lucia. Gosh, this is nice to see everybody.
I wonder if people might take a second to sort of process and put together a question, but I do have one immediately, if that's okay.
Yes. Yes,
it struck me that actually there was a bit of a connection to our last research seminar, thinking about cultural dialogues, although they were thinking of a rather more negative aspect, thinking about cultural appropriation, which I think is a whole nother kind of worms. But I wondered if you wanted to expand a little bit on how you deal with that dialogue that you kept coming back to.
Yeah, I do. It's partly, I think, a generational thing. I don't know that it would affect the students that I teach in the way that it did me. When I was at college, Bernard Leach was hugely influential on the type of course that I did, which was all about studio pottery. And a lot of, as I said, people that are a little bit older, about 10 years, 15 years older than me, British studio potters, just seem to, and they make lovely pots. I mean, they're beautiful, and we have some wonderful examples in the Craft Study Centre. I'm talking about artists like Phil Rogers, Mike Dodd, Jim Malone to an extent. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that they slavishly copied Shoji Hamada and Japanese studio pottery, but you can see a very, very, very clear link, and I think it was necessary for the development of British studio pottery, and they make beautiful pots. They absolutely do. But for me, coming along kind of 10, 15 years after those guys, I was very much aware. I was still aware that there was a weight. Now that tradition was undone in the 70s, and really questioned by artists like Alison Britton and Carol McNichol and Elizabeth Frisch. Fantastic. I mean, it was great, just absolutely, really, really wonderful. But as I said, I studied a studio pottery course, like the very famous course at Harrow. Medway was kind of modelled on that. And we were taught about pots, and Colin Pearson did say to me, that he did feel that as I approached the end of my HND, that I'd probably gone to the wrong college and should have gone to Camberwell, but that I didn't, and I didn't know. To be honest, I didn't. I was unaware, I just wanted to throw pots on the wheel, So what was, that's how it happened for me. But as I said, to go back to sort of that focus, having set a little bit of background, I did begin to wonder about this idea of interpreting as opposed to replicating. Now, we're getting into semantics here when I talk about those other potters, and I say that they're very, very much in a tradition. Maybe I am putting my neck on the block and saying that they're replicating that style, but I wanted to try to interpret it, and I don't get it right. There's absolutely, moments and periods and phases in my work where I do appropriate Japanese techniques and things, but I try to stay nimble with regard to what I then do with it, and that's why I put that slide in from Shima, because it would have been all too easy to make very kind of Japanese style forms for Risa to decorate, but what I did do was I looked back at Stoke-on-Trent forms that had much straighter lines from the early 20th century. So I wanted to kind of present to a Japanese artist that was going to deal with the surface, something that was more akin to my ceramic cultural background, and not to just why would I want to just make Japanese style pots? I'm not, as I said, I'm not Japanese, I'm from Maidstone in Kent, and I wanted to try and acknowledge that. I think that kind of, and as with regard to the idea of cultural appropriation, it's one of these things that we talked about with my colleague Risa in Japan. We talked about the fact that the Britain and Japan historically have been extremely good at nicking ideas. Japan nicked an awful lot from China and Korea, and we did as well. When we go back to, the notion of English tea has become English tea, but we can't grow tea in the UK. And so there is an uncomfortable past to address for both nations there. Japan's invasion of Korea, and obviously our own empire exploits and things like that. There is an uncomfortable element, but we wanted to kind of just be a little bit more sort of intimate and a bit more kind of homely about how we interpreted that through the use of tea sets and utensils for tea. But it's there. That whole notion of appropriation is there, but for me it's about keeping that dialogue alive and just reminding myself of the privilege of having worked very closely in Japan and with a Japanese artist, which is pretty unusual, and to use that privilege and not just kind of nick it, if you like. Yeah, that was a bit of a long-winded one.
No, it's a complicated subject, and that's a really interesting.
Yeah, it is complicated. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And a comment from Gabby that this is beautiful work and very inspiring, of course.
Thank you, Gabby.
Any other questions from anyone?
Look, we're all so tired after this term.
I wonder if, yes, people might reflect afterwards and get in touch with you by email.
Yeah,
So if there's
yeah.
no questions at the moment, I'd just like to thank you again and also say good luck for the Arts Council bid. So fingers crossed we'll see more work
Thank you.
developing from here.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Linda.